Hello there. I found this book, Stanley and the Women by Kingsley Amis, at Tesco's there's like a free bookshelf beyond the tills that you can pick up books, and it's a Penguin book. Well, it's published by Penguin. First published in 1980, 84, 85? 84. So mid-80s. The only other book I'd read by Kingsley Amis was, I think one of his most well-known ones for him was a book called Lucky Jim, which I think he wrote in, what does it say here? Lucky Jim. 1954, so this is like 30 years before, that is. And that was a kind of a comedic book, quite a sort of wry humour, as I remember. A bit self-deprecating of the hero in that book, and it's similar in a way. The main guy that you could gather from the title is a guy called Stanley Duke. He works as an advertising manager for a national newspaper. His second marriage is to a lady called Susan, who works as a literary editor on one of the posher papers, something like a Times literary supplement, something like that, like a literary reviewer. And she's got a kind of a different background to him. There's a thing made of it throughout the book that he comes from south of the river, South London, and he's kind of done well for himself relatively, but comes from a lower social class, so-called. But she's from a kind of a Oxbridge background, although that gets a bit more complicated later on. But he's living in Hampstead, obviously in a really nice house. He's got this job that's quite amusing in its own way. It doesn't seem pressured, but he sort of just rubs along with it. And the editors and a lot of the people at the newspaper are quite unusual, but it's all set in Fleet Street there. They go to these pubs in Fleet Street, but obviously this is before it all moved to Wapping, was it? You know, these kind of newspaper pubs frequented by people who work at newspapers in Fleet Street. He drives this unusual car called an Apfelsine, which I think means orange. I looked it up. I think it's made by a company called FK. Well, it's called an FK Apfelsine, which unusual car. I imagine they don't make them anymore, but that car comes into it quite a bit. He has an ex-wife who is an actress who never really made it, but is still trying to make it. Who's very ambitious, and who he has a child with, a son, Stephen, who's 19, who right at the beginning of the book turns up at the house of Stanley and his new wife, and he's in this distressed state, and he starts talking about something which sounds like a kind of delusion, really, some kind of conspiracy that's going on. I'm not saying all conspiracies are delusions, obviously, but in the book it's obviously shown to be something that's, he's in some kind of possibly psychotic state, I suppose, whatever that means. And eventually a doctor comes, and then he's admitted to a hospital. And then there's a lot about, I don't know if you'd call it mental health, you'd call it the psychiatric system, really, and about the names of, well, they talk about schizophrenia, they talk about something called schizophreniform condition, and there's this old school, older guy, psychiatrist, who's written books and stuff, and he's got a very old school view of it all. But the hospital that Stephen, the 19-year-old son, goes to, she's got this kind of apparently new or modern view of treatment. But when Stanley goes to visit him, he has been given a lot of medication, and he's severely affected by it. But this doctor, Dr. Collins, a female doctor, so it's another one of the women, Stanley and the Women of the book. She's depicted as very strange in a way, but sort of on the patient side, but just very kind of bizarre in her own way of talking and acting in ways that seem outside of any kind of professional conduct, really. And the whole system of the hospital and the way it's run and the way people act also seems disjointed and strange and unusual. I think it's meant to be presented in that way. It feels and sounds there's a hell of a lot of detail about these visits to the hospital and to things like that and what it's like, and so you've got these different viewpoints of different types of or schools of psychiatry and views of so-called madness or whatever, or mental disturbance or mental crises or anguish, and they're kind of at war with each other, and but the son isn't getting better. In fact, it feels like he's getting worse. And there's a lot of talk about his upbringing and whether the parents are responsible, the ex-wife being a lady called Noelle, who's the actress, who seems to be very self-obsessed, but then all the characters are, all the other more adult characters are in their own way, I suppose. The second wife of Stanley, Susan, who's the literary editor, she seems to be, I thought she was going through it, this real strong person that's his kind of rock, as it were, while this is going on with his son, but she's being affected by it as well. But she's like a rock, and very strong and wise and supportive. But I won't say what happens, but that's may not be the case, but put it that way. There's a mother-in-law, which is the mother of the second wife, Susan, and she's Lady something or other, so she's got a view of him that her daughter, Susan, married beneath her in some way. There's an ex-girlfriend kind of floating around who works in the newspaper sector, and she's kind of meant to like a friend, but also possibly always a potential partner as well. So there's all those characters kind of make up the women of the title. It probably would be seen in different areas these days, perhaps by modern reviewers, to have, I don't know what they describe it these days, problematic aspects to it, but I'm not viewing it like that. It's just of I don't want to say it's of its time. It's just it's of its character. The character makes comments about Jewish people, about race, about and very much about women, but not so much him, but other people around him do. Certain of the doctors do, and or the psychiatrist and the GP, who are extraordinary sort of characters in the way they go, quite eccentric and a bit disturbing. And Dr. Collins, the female doctor, is very disturbing as well as a character in the way she presents herself and interacts, as is the first wife. But then, so it's kind of about relationships between men and women, but with this background story of a son of a previous marriage breaking down, and potentially there's moments when you think he's going to seriously hurt someone or hurt himself. I nearly gave up after about 80 pages because I thought, going back to what I was saying about Lucky Jim, there's this kind of wry, self-deprecating humour and self-analysis going through it that felt kind of light and, well, not so much light, but kind of this wryness all the way through it, while this real tragedy is happening in a sense, and the son's breaking down, but there's this kind of quite clever self-deprecation, and I'm glad I stuck with it in a way. It was adapted into a TV series, I believe. I kind of glanced at that, but I can't remember who was in it even. I might give that a look sometime, just out of curiosity about how they present these characters. I did mark out several bits to read out, but perhaps I'll just read out one bit where there's this kind of old school psychiatrist talking about. He's also written a book. This guy, he's called Dr. Nash. He's not the one working at the hospital, but he's got this private Harley Street practice, and he's talking about Shakespeare and figures that are deemed mad or imbalanced in Shakespeare, because he's also done like a book about presentations of insanity or madness in literature. But he's an extraordinary, strange character, really. There's a sense from the blurb at the back that it's it's this kind of lightness about, Stanley Duke thinks it's safe to sink into middle age just when he thinks it's safe to do so. His son Steve goes insane, and then Stanley wonders whether insanity is not something with which all women are intimately acquainted. But I think that gives a false impression of the book, because the men that are involved here, like the second husband of the first wife, so Stanley's first wife's new husband, who's this TV commercial director, whom she apparently married in order to get on in TV, but he doesn't like going to any parties, so it hasn't helped her. He's a character in it he's drunk all the time, and when he's not drunk, he's pretending to be drunk so he doesn't have to engage with his wife. So, and if you thought about the blurb on the back of the book, you're saying, well, that's about the wife, but it isn't. It's about him as well, as much as her. But it's about their relationship. So, the book cover, the way it's kind of been sold through the blurb, is not how I would read it. It's to do with all their issues and why they've got together. Why have they got together, and the mixture of the people. But it's about the difficulties of relationships. Yes, it's about individual foibles, but they've all got them. Stanley himself, there's this talk about psychiatric drugs and everything, but they're all drinking all the way through it. I'm not knocking drinking. I'm just saying that that's a drug as well, in a way, isn't it? So, but it's this idea that they can't see their own. They can't see the props that they need, or the ways that they need to kind of get through their lives as well. And it's almost like having a breakdown or going quote unquote mad is something extraordinary, but their grip on their grip on sort of stability is very tenuous, all of them in that sense. And the jobs they're doing are, and the workplaces are, and the newspaper editor is, and all these other people that kind of turn up, that they're all, it's not what it might seem to be. I thought that's how I read it in the end. It's about people. It's not about women are this or men are this or relationships are impossible. It's about people per se, but I thought there was an element of that it kind of, anyway, that's just something that's on the cover, but really it's something more than that. And the main character, Stanley, he's acknowledged. It's told through his voice, so you haven't got this omniscient narrator that can go into the consciousness or the subjectivity of any of the female characters. It's all through Stanley's eyes and Stanley's voice, which is obviously a narrative technique, a choice to make. You've done it through a character rather than an omniscient narrator that can flexibly move in and out of people's thoughts, more than one person. It's just a choice that's been made. And so that's how you've got to take it. It's through his perceptions. But there's something about the writing as well that makes you think, well, okay, they are his perceptions, but it's being revealed what kind of problems he's got, as it were, or dilemmas or ways of not seeing himself. I mean, there's a bit in it in which it's presented through the main character that the wife of a doctor, another doctor, this is a GP, I think, has got a problem, and it's kind of presented in a way, that's just the person having a problem because they're a woman and men are doing certain things. But the reality is they're meant to be coming back there for dinner, and they've both been in the pub and they've had about 14 whiskies each. So I don't know how conscious that is, that, the reader can say, well, you can understand somebody having a bit of an issue with that. Maybe she's been, it's all being prepared. She's doing something to help her husband and his friend, and they've turned up drunk, basically. And a lot of people would be miffed by that, but it's not presented in that way because it's being presented through the perception of this character, who may be, to a lesser or greater degree, jaundiced by the particular relationships he's had and still has to negotiate while his son has gone through this breakdown. The thing about the son and the breakdown is that there's a lot of very stark and quite painful stuff, very painful stuff being shown about it and the way he's being broken down. But as I said before, there's this wry kind of self stuff that's all about, I don't know, it made me think, you're not taking it seriously, this is kind of being used. But I kind of got over that a little bit, because it does go into it a lot, the son's experience. What you don't really get is, other than in reflected memory, is what the son was like before so much. He's as soon as we meet him, he's begun this journey of breakdown. So we haven't seen him in a prior state, really told about him as a boy, etc., that there was no sign of anything going wrong, as it were. But it calls into question the whole concept of some of these psychiatric terms, some of these labels, some of these conditions that labelled in different ways. It calls into question psychiatric drugs as well, and the effects of those, and the kind of sense that the psychiatric establishment or profession doesn't know what it's doing, and that it's at cross purposes in many ways, and there are different people with vastly different viewpoints on apparently the same condition. And maybe this applies to other physical, medical conditions as well. So it does bring that out as well. So just to conclude, I'll just read one little bit. I didn't realise I'd be speaking so long about it, but this is a bit from this. They're in a restaurant. They're always going to restaurants. Well, a lot of the time they're going to restaurants and pubs and drinking a lot. All the other characters around it. So they go to see this posh psychiatrist, Harley Street guy, who's the first person they bring in before Stephen, the son, is sent to this hospital in London. And the guy's called Nash, Dr. Nash, and they're at his favourite little Italian restaurant, and he's just talking about Shakespeare, because he's, like I said, he's done this thing about presentations of madness, insanity, instability in Shakespeare, and he says the following in this restaurant while they're all sort of drinking. So he's there with Stanley, who's the Stanley of the title, the father of Stephen, and he's there with Susan, who's the second wife, who's the literary person that does literary reviews and stuff. So this part is from just a little bit over halfway through the book. So Stephen's already in hospital. This is Dr. Nash speaking. Shakespeare got it right. Lear, of course. Cerebral atherosclerosis, a senile organic disease of the brain, quite common in old age. Periods of mania followed by amnesia. Rational episodes marked by great fear of what he might have done while manic, and great dread of the onset or renewed onset of mania. That way madness lies. Let me shun that too, no more of that. Perhaps even more striking, Ophelia, a particular form of acute schizophrenia, very, very thoroughly set up, young girl of a timid, meek disposition, no mother, no sister, the brother she depends on not available, lover apparently gone mad enough anyway to kill her father. Entirely characteristic that a girl with her sort of upbringing should go round spouting little giggling harmless obscenities when mad. In fact, it's such a good description that this subdivision of schizophrenia is known as the Ophelia syndrome, even to those many psychiatrists who have never seen or read the play. He was content just to describe it, you see, no theories or interpretations. Oh, she says and does plenty of things that mean a great deal to the other characters and to the audience, but she doesn't know what she's saying or doing or who anyone is because she's mad. So that's the end of Nash's speech, and it goes into narration. The main character's narration. They're in the restaurant. Our starters came then, and I thought we might have heard the last of the topic. So these are Stanley Duke's thoughts, but not a bleeding bit of it. I had no great objection to Shakespeare as an author. It was just that I thought he was rather far back as something to talk about over lunch. I'm interjecting here. Do you see what I mean about the kind of wryness? It's kind of going to get the humour out of... It's kind of... anyway. Rather far back as something to talk about over lunch. Also, I reckoned I had learnt enough about schizophrenia for one day. Anyhow, in less than a minute, and without waiting to be asked, Nash, that's the doctor, was off again. Oh, the play's full of interesting remarks about madness, among other things. Yes, Polonius, a rather underrated fellow in my opinion. To define true madness, what is it but to be nothing else but mad? Not bad at all, not a complete definition but an essential part, excluding the north-northwest madness. Later in the same scene, you remember, he has a chat with Hamlet, the fishmonger conversation, and is made a fool of, the very model of a dialogue between stupid questioner and clever madman, as seen by that unusual person R.D. Lang, the divided self and all that. But actually, Hamlet's only pretending to be mad, isn't he? No problem scoring off the other chap if that's what you're up to. Polonius gets halfway to the point. How pregnant sometimes his replies are, he says, a happiness that often madness hits on, which reason and sanity could not so prosperously be delivered of. A remarkably 20th century view. If he'd paused to think, he might have found it just a bit suspect. But Hamlet in general very cleverly behaves in a way that lay people who've never seen a madman except a madman to behave... Sorry, I don't know what that means. But Hamlet in general, this is Nash continuing the last bit of his speech, but Hamlet in general, he says, the doctor's speaking, very cleverly behaves in a way that lay people who've never seen a madman expect a madman to behave. Ophelia doesn't go mad until Act 4. Close quote. Then back to the general narration. The two of them went on, that's the Dr. Nash and Susan, the second wife. The two of them went on having the time of their lives, working their way through Gothic novels and then Dickens, who either left mad people out altogether or was no good at them, though evidently terrific on neurosis. So I'll leave it there. That's just like from about the middle of the book, and that's Nash's view. This kind of old school, I suppose, for want of a better expression, old school psychiatrist who's reducing characters in literature to these sort of quite limited psychiatric views of them. In my opinion, I don't. Anyway, from my perspective, from reading the plays and knowing the plays, I couldn't disagree more. Not necessarily about every single statement he makes. Like, for example, about whether Hamlet is pretending or not, and there's an element there that if you pretend so much, do you become the thing you pretend? And then it's calling into question what quote unquote madness is anyway. But anyway, that's probably for another whole other discussion. It's a lot more to that, and this is just really about this book, and that maybe gives a sense of a little bit of the texture of it. But although it's just through that one character, this doctor, who's quite disturbing in his own way, as is the more quote-unquote modern type of doctor, Dr. Collins, who's the one that's in charge of Stanley's son at the hospital. She's presented, or at least through Stanley Duke, the hero or the main character of the book, through his perception, she's presented as a very disturbed person herself, as is another doctor at the hospital that they go to. Happens to be an Indian doctor, but there is a nurse or a matron there who seems sort of more reliable. So that world is presented as very, very disturbed and disturbing in and of itself from its so-called professional point of view, Anyway, I'll leave it there. So that's my little talk about Stanley and the Women from 1984 by Kingsley Amis. He's passed away now. He was a lifetime friend of Philip Larkin, I believe, and they used to exchange lots of letters, and he also wrote poems as well. He wrote quite a lot of other novels and a lot of non-fiction. Kingsley Amis did. Obviously, Philip Larkin wrote, mainly known for poems. I'd say Kingsley Amis is probably mainly known as a novelist, isn't he, rather than a poet, but he did write poems and some short stories, it says here, and non-fiction books on things like science fiction. He was really into science fiction, and Rudyard Kipling, and I think he wrote a kind of a version of a James Bond sort of story under a pseudonym as well, so obviously a fan of that. He passed away in 1981. Sorry, I beg your pardon. No, that's not right. Scrub that. He was given the CBE in 1981. It was just the last sentence of his little biography. I can't remember when he passed away, but obviously after, because otherwise he would have passed away 4 years before he wrote this book I've been talking about. But I'm assuming he passed away. He has passed away, Kingsley Amis, I know that. And his son, as has his son, Martin Amis. But anyway, I'll leave it there. Thanks very much for listening, if anyone has, and all the best. Take care. Bye.